Good afternoon. It's just after 4 o'clock. I think we'll get started with our session today. My name is Christopher Morphew, and I am Dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Education. On behalf of all the members of the eSchool Plus initiative here at Hopkins, I want to officially welcome you to the kickoff session in our second eSchool Plus webinar series. Our topic today is Race and Return to School, Build the Whole School Back Better. I think I assume that's an ode to the Biden administration, so that's very catchy. Our goal for this session is to explore how and why reopening schools has become such a highly charged and politicized issue, and to consider what this means for equity and schools now as we see more and more schools continue to reopen in what is nearing, hopefully, a post-pandemic stage for K-12 education. We're also going to be exploring the enormous hurdles that K-12 schools across the nation continue to face in the midst of an unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic. So as we've just seen, the issue of reopening our schools has moved beyond the field of education. You can't turn on the television, on the radio, check your Twitter feed. Sometimes I try to stay away from my Twitter feed without a discussion of how, when, and how quickly America should reopen its K-12 schools. One of the things you'll learn very quickly from your Twitter feed is there are lots and lots of experts out there on this subject, or at least lots of people with very strong opinions. So the pandemic has really opened it up differences of opinions along political lines and racial lines regarding what we've seen with schools closing and now reopening, how that's impacted our most vulnerable students at public schools, as well as how thoughts for how families of color could have responded differently to the challenges of reopening. So today we've invited several of the foremost education and policy experts in our field to discuss this topic in a complex, within this complex, changing, and highly consequential landscape. So let me start out by introducing our panelists. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Otis Johnson Jr. Thank you for being here today, Otis. Dr. Johnson is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor here at Johns Hopkins and has faculty appointments in the School of Education, as well as the Bloomberg School of Public Health and the Department of Sociology at the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences here at Hopkins. Otis is also the Executive Director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Safe and Healthy Schools. Again, welcome to Otis. Next, we're honored to have with us Dr. Adrian Dixon, who is a professor of education policy, organization, and leadership at the University of Illinois College of Education in Urbana-Champaign. Her primary research interests focus on how issues of race, class, and gender intersect and impact educational equity in urban schooling contexts. Glad to have you here, Adrian. Thank you. And finally, we have with us Shayna Terrell. Shayna is the Director of Pipeline Programming for the Center for Black Educator Development, which has just been awarded, congratulations, Shayna, a $3.1 million to train up to 21,000 aspiring African-American teachers. She's worked for more than 20 years with vulnerable student populations, including 10 years of Freedom School experience. She has just launched a weekly podcast, so she's an expert at all of this, entitled Building the Black Educator Pipeline, that airs live on Thursdays at noon or on YouTube or Facebook or Shayna, I suspect, wherever you get your podcasts. She is currently working to diversify the educator pipeline by designing and implementing programs that recruit, train, and retain aspiring educators. We welcome your thoughts on today's topic as well. Shayna, thank you for being here. And thank you all for being here who's tuned into this for us today. As I said, this is the first in the second suite of seminars that the eSchool Plus group is organizing. So you'll hear more about upcoming events as well here in the future. I want to thank everyone for being here, and let me give a few ground rules about our discussion this afternoon. I'm going to start by asking each of our experts one question to get the discussion started. Then I'll be directing a series of prepared questions to the entire group for consideration, opportunity for them to jump in. But we want you, our audience, to join in too. We want this to be as interactive as possible. You can submit questions by pressing the Q&A button below at the bottom of your screen. It's right there at the sort of bottom right of your screen. And if you see a question, by the way, you can also submit a like button so you can upvote someone else's question. We'll incorporate as many questions as possible into our discussion today, and we'll start with audience questions somewhere around 4:30 or so after we've gone through with each of the panelists one or two questions that we have prepared in advance. So again, welcome everyone, our panelists as well as our audience. Now let's get started. I'll go ahead and start right away with Professor Johnson, Otis. In addition to being a researcher and scholar in higher education around this issue, you've also got a very interesting and relevant background as a former St. Louis school board member, and I'm sure you can build on that as well. And I'd like to start by asking you, how has race continued to play out in the reopening of our nation's public schools? And what are the challenges that districts across the country continue to face as they reopen schools right now?
Thank you, Chris, for the question. And it's wonderful to be here with two wonderful panelists. And I want to thank eSchool Plus, the entire group, for hosting this event. And the question is really an important one, but I want to preface it by saying that we don't just have one pandemic, there really are two pandemics. And I've always been arguing that other pandemic is racial injustice. And of course, the COVID pandemic has intersected with these long-standing, pre-existing problems within education and justice that have really animated, magnified, intensified some of the inequalities, the racial inequalities that continue to be challenges. So not only are we dealing with the racially disparate impact of COVID, its disparate impact on the economies of families, its impact on their health, on the well-being of kids, and the well-being of their schools. But we're also dealing with pre-existing inequalities and inequities, especially within education, especially within wraparound services, all of these resources that communities need to thrive. And so I can imagine that many teachers right now are feeling as though, if they have access to a vaccine, or if they don't have access to a vaccine, how will they prepare kids? Will they even go back to their jobs? Will they be safe doing so? And I bet families are also having their own difficulties or challenges. Many of them are wanting to send their kids back to school, of course, because we have basically shifted education into the families' living rooms, kitchens, dining room tables, and so forth, without also shifting resources. So yes, families would like to see their kids go back to school. But at the same time, COVID has disproportionately impacted the Black and Brown and Indigenous communities to the point where they may feel more apprehensive about sending their kids back to school. And here, I don't know that schools are equally well positioned to make that transition. Urban schools in particular face different sets of challenges, whether it's crowding in some of them, infrastructure, which would lead to questions about ventilation, venting and clean air issues. I think some school systems are also dealing with the fact that that these other technologies that are needed right now are not in place. So I think there are a whole host of issues that urban schools in particular would be dealing with as they decide whether or how they can best reopen and accommodate the wishes of the public. So I think that there are lots of issues on the table that we have to deal with. One of the big ones, of course, for me in my own research is how well prepared are schools to actually mitigate some of the inequities that have grown while kids were away from school. So these education gaps, these opportunity gaps, I imagine are going to be much larger than they have been in the past. And I don't know what or how prepared schools are to deal with that, or even if they've imagined what education must look like in order for them to deliver the type of instruction that will deal with COVID's wake. So there are just a whole host of issues that I think communities of color are having to deal with that haven't been attended to, at least in through a national or federal strategy, and definitely might be somewhat patchwork in its character across states in different school systems.
Thanks, Otis. One of the things that you mentioned in your response there was issues that around urban schools. And as a segue, let me move to Adrienne. And when I introduced you, Professor Hickson, I talked about your research, which focuses on issues of race, class, and gender and how they intersect. But you're particularly interested in equity in urban schooling context. So I turn to you and I would ask, one of the things that we've learned from the pandemic is that some children are thriving and some children aren't. Many parents of color have indicated that their children are thriving during remote learning. How important are culturally competent, trauma-informed, and anti-racism efforts in the drive to reopen schools? Are we doing enough in this space?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. And thank you again for inviting me. And Otis is my classmate from the University of Michigan. So it's always nice to connect with a classmate. I'm honored to be here. So let me say that, I'm not surprised that families of color, and in particular Black families, are finding that their children are doing better at home than they are at school. As you stated, I study urban schools. And one of the challenges that we've had is helping teachers and school systems understand the importance of culturally relevant pedagogy, and both at the curricular level, but at the pedagogical level, at the teaching level. So we're seeing that in places where, kids are home with people who know them in a space that they, for the most part, right, feel comfortable. And there is a familiarity. If you're home with your family, they're very familiar with you and can use references and language that and that help to communicate information. That's the kind of stuff that we ask that teachers in schools adopt in their practices. Those practices are very important, particularly for African-American students, because schools often don't see the value in the language practices and the culture that students bring to school. And so when we can kind of match their culture and affirm it, we can maximize on their learning experiences there. And I'll push a little bit on the trauma-informed, because that ideology is somewhat contested, because for many of us, we see it as kind of a recasting of cultural deficit language to presume that kids of color, when we use the kind of language and again the ideology of trauma informed, we're assuming that that the trauma is external to the school, and that it is only located in the kind of communities that kids live in, and that they are somehow damaged, and that the school is kind of a neutral place. And in my research, I found that often schools are the site of trauma for kids of color. From our young babies through high school kids, it is a place where they are cast as the other, as not belonging, and they are not affirmed. And so that is very traumatizing. So they're often at odds. And when we use, again, the trauma-informed practices, we assume that school is the neutral, safe place, and that there's something else that's traumatizing them, when in fact, and we have enough, just recently, with the young and mostly young women, Black women who are being manhandled, right? Having violent interactions with school police, school resource officers. I would argue that's trauma. And in what ways are we trying to, engage these young students in making sense of school as a site of trauma, and teachers and adults who work in those buildings as complicit in inflicting that trauma? If you call a police officer on a child, not just a 14-year-old, but a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or a 9-year-old, you are complicit in the trauma that those students experience, even when you think you're quote unquote teaching them a lesson. What lesson does a 5-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 14-year-old need to learn about the criminal justice system that they need to be threatened by a police officer or handcuffed, put in a police car? That is trauma. And for many Black children, of late, the first time they encounter the police are at school, in a way where they are the criminal. So I want to encourage schools as we, think about reopening and sending our children back. What are we sending them back to? Are we sending them back to places where, again, they are being affirmed, where they are seen, where they are encouraged, where they are pushed intellectually? Do those places exist for our children? I would say that we are hard pressed to find them broadly, particularly in urban environments. There are schools that exist, but they're isolated and they're not the normal experience for most of our children. So,
Thanks, Adrian. So finally, Shayna, it's your turn to join the conversation. When I introduced you, I talked about the fact that you've been in the trenches for a long time on issues of race and equity in education, and that right now you're involved in a pretty massive teacher preparation effort, getting more African-American teachers in the classroom. I wanted to pose a question to you about that. What are some of the possible impacts of this incredibly politicized environment for teacher education and teacher preparation? Right now, surveys are telling us that so many teachers, I saw one recently that was 27% of teachers are considering leaving the profession. Why is this important for families of color?
Thank you all for having me. And I think that's a really great question, Chris, to really explore. So one of the things we have to think about when we think about teacher preparation, going back to school and reopening schools in this environment, even trying to support teachers in this particular climate, is completely different from what people are used to. The support that teachers receive, even in ways of training, feedback, hands-on training, hands-on observations, it's a completely different world in a virtual world. And you're talking about some districts who are hybrid one day and virtual the next. You're talking about some teachers who have to teach kids in person and teach kids virtually. So even the thought process of how we generally are used to preparing teachers in a traditional way is completely different than what we would normally do. People have to think about different ways to support teachers in terms of tools, in terms of resources. The part that really concerns me about supporting teachers is that research shows previously that teachers didn't feel supported and didn't feel prepared. And when we talk about Black teachers in particular, the attrition rate after about 2 years in the profession, Black teachers will leave because they don't feel supported. And one of the major things about preparation isn't just training people to do a job or supporting people in a job. In this climate, people need to feel safe, and not just physically safe, they need to feel emotionally safe. And as we know, with Black teachers, a lot of times spaces aren't created for them. They don't feel affirmed. They don't feel culturally or emotionally safe themselves. So I'm hoping that all that COVID has exposed will encourage districts to treat their Black and brown teachers a lot better, and to consider in preparation, not just the skills that they need, but also mentoring and supporting teachers effectively. And when you say, what does this mean for Black families? When you have surveys that give out numbers like 27% of teachers are leaving profession, I would be curious to know, where were those teachers from and what districts are they serving? We already have a large population of our teachers who report that they don't even feel prepared to work in urban classrooms, or they're not prepared to even teach culturally diverse students. So my wonder is, where would that 27% be from? The sad part is that unfortunately, families of color, or definitely families, we're talking about families specifically in urban districts, they unfortunately get a lot of teachers who come into their districts unprepared. They already suffer from a teacher shortage. So if 27% of teachers, and a larger part of that, are in urban districts, unfortunately, our Black families are going to be the ones who are going to suffer. They're going to be the ones who are going to have the resource shortage or the teacher shortage, and trying to find folks to actually teach in those districts. So a number of things are going to come up for our families of color. So yes, families are thriving. And I know that they're talking mainly about their student engagement, right? So a lot of students are more engaged virtually because of the reasons that Dr. Dixon said. But the other part is just that we can't deny is just because of COVID, families are behind academically, like they just are. So now you're talking about a teacher shortage that's going to greatly impact that. Families are going to have some serious issues with finding resources to get their children where they need to be academically if we're talking about a teacher shortage. But schools have to find way more creative ways to be able to support their teachers emotionally and physically, as well as give them the preparation that they need.
Thanks, Shayna. Adrienne, let me go back to you and follow up a bit on what I've heard from several of the panelists, including you. You expressed, I think, a bit of healthy skepticism about trauma-informed teaching, and part of what I heard in your response is that much of the trauma that children are facing today, or not, at least some of it, is a result of what's happening in schools, not what's happening necessarily outside schools. Do you think, you mentioned SROs as one example of that, school resource officers, police officers in school. Do you think that this pandemic has exposed and provided us with some opportunities to rethink resources like school resource officers? And is there an opportunity here to engage in some significant systemic change?
I think we are at a wonderful opportunity to rethink how we do school. I think we, not only school resource officers, I don't think the schools have ever really tried restorative justice. My question to schools is, what are we restoring children to, right? So in restorative justice, the presumption was that the environment was whole and healthy and equitable, right? And it was a space, again, where kids felt affirmed. Our children don't attend those, by and large, our children don't attend schools like that. So when schools that were already problematic and our children were overly surveilled, overly disciplined, and then you go in and you overlay a practice that presumes some sort of equity and justice, it's hypocritical. What are we restoring children to? We're restoring them to a system that was already unfair to them. And many teachers and schools that interpreted restorative justice would place the onus on the child. What are you going to do differently? There was no implication of the adults to change their behaviors or rethink policies and practices that made it impossible. And I always say to teachers when I talk to them, like, why do you want to win this fight? Right? This is a 5-year-old, or this is a 14-year-old. What is it about, is this the power struggle you want to have with the child? What is this really about? So I think we need to rethink that. What kind of environments do we want for our children? And I think that we need to make schools places that are much more friendly to and welcoming to community members, to not just families. I study education reform in charter schools, primarily in New Orleans, and the discourse has been so divided that there are schools that some of the rhetoric that ed reformers kind of adopt is that schools are for families and for students only, and that's the only constituencies that they have to address. No, schools live in communities. Schools live in cities. And the history of Black folks is that we have always cared about how our children have been educated, whether we birthed them, whether they were our children by blood or not. There is this notion of fictive kinship that extended well beyond just your kind of church families, but it was extended to communities and neighborhoods. And so there's a deep investment in the places where we send our children, because we're all impacted by that. And so I think schools need to rethink this notion of, what does it mean to be a good neighbor? And when I work with schools, I ask them, what does it mean to be a good neighbor? You are a neighbor here. And how do you work with and live within this community? And so we need to drastically rethink. And again, I look at schools where Black children go. So I don't know about white schools necessarily. I don't study that. But I do think we have an opportunity to hold school districts accountable to the communities in which they serve and where they are located. And that is a holistic kind of review of not just kind of the, not just what if police officers are there, but what does it mean to be a good neighbor in this community? And I don't know that we've ever held schools to answering that question, and we have an opportunity to do that.
Thanks, Adrian. Let me come back to you, Shayna, and you're involved in training teachers, and one of the things that I think the pandemic has exposed is that we hadn't prepared teachers very well to work in multiple platforms, multiple modalities, and yet we asked them, snapping our fingers, we asked them to move to remote or hybrid learning environments. So as you think about training the next generation or two of educators who are going to be working in urban schools, African-American educators going to be working in urban schools, what do we need to do differently in terms of training our teachers to work in multiple platforms, modalities? I saw on the news earlier today, lots of districts are thinking about or even starting remote sort of parallel remote systems for their districts post-pandemic, even when the schools are open. So how is this going to change how we need to train our teachers?
I think one of the number one ways is our teachers that are currently in the field are going to need a completely different ramp up and a completely different change. But I think that sometimes we think about this problem in the right now, and we don't think about this problem as an extension of the entire pipeline. And I think that's where we fall short, because we don't invest in early pipeline initiatives to train teachers. So this needs to start with training teachers way beyond when they get into teacher colleges, or way beyond when they get into an actual district and districts are training them. We need to rethink on how we're even building the pipeline to recruit teachers. And then once they get in, the supports that they're needing for that. Dr. Dixon hinted on an excellent point when she was talking about school culture. I spent 15 years in education, primarily dealing with school culture and school discipline issues. So a lot of this also is going to have to work into teacher mindset and how we're training our teachers to look at the profession, and how we're going to be training our teachers to look at the needs of the students and their families. I think that some of the things you're hinting to is we can provide the technical support. The technical support is out there to incorporate into training. And I think that teachers will be open to that. I think we run the risk and run into a lot of problems with teacher mindset because we're not properly teaching or helping our teachers develop healthy pedagogies when we're interacting and teaching. And I think that that is a huge problem with teacher preparation. The technical parts, I think we can do, right? People might get anxiety about 21st century and tech and stuff like that. But once you give people appropriate training and proper training, right, they're Zoom experts. Once they get in there, start playing around with stuff and all the different platforms, Zoom, Schoology, Power School, Parent Square, right? Because it's 1,000 of them. But I think once you get on there and provide those technical trainings for people, they're fine. But I really think that we're going to have to support this new generation of teachers around building really healthy and political and liberating pedagogies for our students and our families. And I think that that will then lead them open to the technical assistance they're going to need to be excellent teachers. But again, that starts with the extension of the pipeline. And that really digs down into when you get real granular. What courses are we giving high school students who are interested in teaching to prepare them, right, to be a teacher? Again, if there's a course on technical platforms, Zoom, or the creative lesson with Adobe, why isn't a high school student getting some of those creative courses while they're in high school? Why does that have to wait until they're either in teacher college or out of teacher colleges? And a lot of teacher colleges only talk about theory. So why do we have to wait till we're actually inside of a district to get those type of technical training? we should be thinking about the teacher pipeline all the way down, starting in middle school, and how we're going to build that up and give folks what they need. But if we're talking about the right now, districts do need to think about what technical support teachers need and make sure they're building the correct partnerships and provide that for their districts.
Thanks, Shayna. So, Otis, moving to you, you mentioned in your first response to the question I asked you that different districts are going to need support from states and even potentially the federal government. So I wanted to follow up with that and ask you, we've got up to 3 million or more children that have been disengaged from learning over the past year. What role can or should the federal government play right now in ensuring greater equity in resources for children of color as schools reopen?
A great question, Chris. It's clear that we needed leadership and we didn't have it. And what instead happened was, abandonment of school systems to put in place what they could with the resources they had. And unfortunately, that just wasn't enough. One of the things that Dr. Dixon has already mentioned, and we're not so certain about how well students have fared during this. Some of them have done well. Kids and moms are reporting that they're doing better, but because the federal government didn't think about coordinating with the states about how to even measure progress during this time, whether we should have assessments or whether we shouldn't have assessments, I'm unclear whether students are doing better, even if they feel they're doing better, even if they feel like they're engaged. We have no idea what's going on in this space, this black box of COVID with kids, and we will find out when they get back to school. But then we run into the next conversation about, well, whether we should assess even then, because we know that there hasn't been an equal pandemic, right? Racially, the pandemic has impacted kids' learning in racially disparate ways. So clearly some conversation, some public dialogue, and some coordination among states should have been really thought through, because again, I don't know that even the metrics that schools are using to say that children are now more engaged than they have been in the past are uniform enough for us to learn anything from them and are reliable. For example, there's this school system nearby, I'm not going to say which one it is, but their metric of having attended, right, being present, is that they turned in one activity from the day and showed up at the start of classroom, basically homeroom. But I don't know, for example, what happens the rest of the instructional time. We don't even know how much instructional time kids are getting on average. That varies greatly, even across classrooms. Some are suggesting that 4 to 6 hours is a full educational day. And that's not what we're used to. So just in that regard, when we get back to school, we're going to be confronted with some realities of how well we did or did not do while they were at home learning. And so that's where I think we could have a little more, a little more information that would allow us to prepare for that reality. And then, Chris, I wanted to also mention one other thing about what Dr. Dixon said with respect to trauma-informed practices and restorative justice. And she is right that restorative justice presupposes that there's justice, right? And it also presupposes that there should be a calling out and an addressing of systemic and structural racism. Without that being done, then there is no restorative justice and there are no trauma-informed practices. So when I speak of restorative justice, and trauma-informed practices. I am speaking with them with the understanding that ABAR, anti-bias, anti-racism, that's ABAR, is needed first. And that's been a problem for schools because they don't even want to mention race. They don't want to talk about race. They definitely don't want to talk about systemic racism or structural racism, because those are things that make people unwilling to dialogue. It shuts down conversations instead of opening up the possibility for kids of color. So school systems, when we reopen, need to be about systemic racism, structural racism, challenging it, because the pressure of trying to come back from the pandemic's forces and the way that it's impacted kids' learning is going to bring about a different level of frustration, a different level of accountability even. And without that basic understanding of the other pandemic, where we've been all this time before, and how the new pandemic of COVID has magnified, intensified that, then we're really going to be making the previous pandemic worse, right? I don't know what's going to happen to kids when we come to school not prepared to understand systemic racism and structural racism, but yet want to address the setbacks that COVID is going to make. So those are just some of the thoughts I have about those two things in particular. And yes, if we had an administration that was also interested in social leadership, moral leadership, character leadership, then we would have been talking about these things as well. So I'll just leave it there.
Thanks, Otis. Shayna, let me go back to you and build a little bit on what I heard in Otis's response to my question. You've worked in charter schools as a school leader. What advice would you have for parents of students of color when they come back and schools reopening? How can parents and their communities, the communities in which these students live and work, as Adrienne was talking about, how can these parents be effective advocates for their students once schools reopen?
I think one of the biggest ways that parents have to know that they're advocates and they have to know that they have the power. I think that it may have been, I'm not sure if it was Dr. Dixon or Dr. Johnson who spoke to this earlier, but we're speaking about schools being in communities. It was Dr. Dixon, and like, you are of service to the community. I think that there are a lot of times when schools act like the parent is of service to them. Parents need to understand that the school is of service to them and it's their job to provide customer service. I think that parents need to make high demands for what they feel like their child needs, especially since a lot of parents have been home with their own child for a year. And there are some parents who see equivocal differences in between how my child was at home and how my child was at school. And they need to examine those things and try to find out why and what are the differences. What am I providing for my child that you are not providing here? Why is my child feeling like they're coming into a space that's oppositional to them? Or why are we having conversations about my child not being able to comprehend or follow certain things when maybe it's you and your teaching practices that need a little bit of support? And this isn't a conversation that I'm having to try to bash teachers or come down on teachers, but this is more of a conversation about parents feeling empowered to actually speak up and use their voice for their child. I think a lot of times in our current education system, parents' voices are silenced. I also think that with the new it's not new, just American indoctrination and what we think schools are, a place that we send our kids to be educated, and then we have a hands-off responsibility as parents. I think what the pandemic has taught parents is that they have to be involved in what's going on with their child. So though your child is going back to a building to be educated, you as a parent still need to be hands-on in what curriculum your child is learning, and what type of teacher your child has. What kind of policies does that school have for you as a parent to actually have a voice? Ask questions about your school's board. What percentage of parents' voice is represented on that board? What percentage of community voice is represented on that board? Are you as a school even interested in taking the voices or the opinions of parent or community members? Because a lot of times schools don't function in that way. They function as like, we are the experts. And again, you are not of service. You're of service to us. We're not of service to you. I know best. When parents are the true experts on their child, right? Schools are there to help to guide on, strategies or what to do next, but the parent knows their child best. And we should be working together in tandem to make sure that children are getting supports and what their needs. So my advice to parents would be, make sure that you demand to be heard. Make sure you're organized, because that's another issue. I think a lot of times parents go up, solo with issues when there are a group of parents who are having the same struggles and the same issues, maybe even with one particular teacher or a few particular policies, and they don't talk to each other and they're not organized in terms of working together to get something changed, to have a conversation with the principal, to talk to the CEO or the superintendent of their district. So I encourage parents to be more organized, to use their voice, and to feel empowered, to make sure that their children are getting the resources that they need for their education.
Thanks, Shayna. I'll remind our audience too, if they want to submit questions, they can use the Q&A button. Before we get to an audience question, though, I want to give Adrienne the chance to follow up on that. Adrienne, you mentioned that you are actively involved in understanding charter schools, particularly in New Orleans. I think advocates of charter schools would say that they're a place where schools can be better connected to the communities, where experiments can happen and new strategies can be tried out. Building on what Shayna was just talking about in terms of parent engagement, what are you seeing in charter schools that gives you hope around how they're engaging with their communities in this pandemic, and how parents can positively shape how the schools are engaging their students?
So I'll say in New Orleans, and I'm just going to be blunt, that's one of the abiding issues and critiques of charter schools in New Orleans, is that there is, it's very opaque how schools operate. Groups have had to file Freedom of Information Act requests just to get basic information. And so I think if we were to think kind of specifically about New Orleans, but charter schools perhaps in general, that adopt the New Orleans model, that transparency in operations is a basic thing. And this shouldn't be the demand of parents. These are public institutions that have a responsibility, to Shayna's point, to the public. You serve the public. And so that's the kind of baseline pieces that we're just asking for transparency. And most parents are, and there are kind of a diversity of parents that send their kids to public schools. In New Orleans, the only option for parents is charter schools, but there's still a diversity of parents. And it's stratified by class. So parents, we're in a city that is, it's a poor city for the most part. We have a large population of the working poor, or people who service the tourism industry. And so going to school at quote unquote normal business hours is difficult if you work in the hotels, or if you work in a restaurant, or if you drive Uber. And so I think this again is the piece where schools have to think differently about how they serve. And that's just across the board. But I have to, I hate to be kind of to rain on the parade, but I haven't seen a lot of positive there in terms of parent engagement. And I think it could be done much differently than it is now. And one of the challenges that we face in New Orleans is that there are very few neighborhood schools that service African-American families. There are neighborhood charter schools. They tend to be predominantly white, and they service upper middle class families. Professors at Tulane, or families who live in the Tulane area. So fairly well-to-do families that rely on the school bus transportation. Those schools don't tend to be as open to families, and it's harder for them to navigate and be involved. And so we have to, again, kind of rethink what engagement looks like in that kind of context. And we haven't done that, but I think there's an opportunity to do that.
Thank you, Adrienne. It's not positive news, but we need to hear it, and I appreciate that. Otis, I know you have an interest in health equity, and with and part of that is mental health. Could you talk a little bit about what you think the role of school counselors, school social workers, mental health specialists is in addressing the mental health, socio-emotional needs of children after their return to school?
Well, getting back to what has already been said, clearly they've got to return to a school that affirms them, that one where they feel like they belong, um, that they are expected to do, um, um, great work, and not just kids that are troublemakers or are just there to be disciplined and watched after until mom comes or dad comes and picks them up. It's not. Um, there has to be a school climate that's conducive to children thriving, and that social emotional well-being is really important. Um, and so I am concerned about kids and COVID and how it has taken a toll on their mental health potentially. I mean, there's not the best data out there, but we have, even prior to COVID, we were experiencing an increase in suicide rates among young kids, and definitely among those of color. So yes, there are some social emotional needs and well-being, mental health needs that everyone has, and definitely our kids. So I am also concerned about the well-being of schools and how they can meet those needs. We currently have very few healthcare professionals within school systems. If you recall the Flint water crisis, for example, it was that crisis that exposed the fact that they had one health professional to serve the whole district, and that they had ended up um, training schools, the school front office staff to give aspirin to kids. So that's a very big, large school system, relatively speaking. Yet even there was no healthcare. There was only one healthcare professional to serve the needs of all those kids. We're going to have to get serious about giving kids wraparound services that meets their health needs, that meets their social emotional needs, and doesn't criminalize them for having those needs, or unfairly labels them as disabled because they have those needs. Um, Again, after COVID, or at least as we're dealing with the recovery from COVID, we're going to have to think about resources. And I understand why Maryland House Bill 496, which is a local bill here that is entitled Counselors Not Cops, is suggesting that we reallocate those funds that would go toward SRO, school resource officers, to fund counselors and to fund healthcare professionals within schools. I think that's immensely important, even though um, I understand that some school systems are grappling with the thought about losing their SROs, or not having their security needs met. We're going to have a priority here among our institutions that serve our most vulnerable populations in our future, that their health comes first. And definitely, we're going to have to, in just a more terrific way, fund wraparound services within schools that can address a lot of these social emotional needs and health needs.
Thanks, Otis. Adrian, let me go back to you for another question. What do you think with the learning gaps, the COVID slide, whatever we're going to call this, that happens as a result of the learning loss? What needs to be done? What can and what should be done to stem this significant learning loss that's going to disproportionately affect communities of color once we start to discover what these gaps are?
Mhm. Well, I think, again, this is a part of kind of schools being in communities. There are boys and girls clubs, there are community centers that historically kind of provided some support, but because of how, municipalities have had to think about their budgeting, those services have been cut. If I think we're at a moment, I think the pandemic exposed the 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 disproportionate and devastating impact a kind of unstable social safety net has had on people just in general, but in particular for our most vulnerable communities. And I think we see that it's important. The stimulus package kind of certainly shows that across the board, everyone needs the support. And that for most of us, we grew up with a recreation center, with a parks department that had summer programming, the CETA program where kids could work and they would do projects in the city and would get paid for it in the summer. So there are investments that we can make in our public infrastructure to help bolster those places where kids need the extra support. The National Science Fund, I actually have a project looking at community-based science and programs that are purposely out of school programs that are they're STEM programs that are on purpose located out of school. And I think that we can do much more investment in that kind of out of school learning and not institutionalize children. So we don't need to extend the school day. We don't need to replicate school in after school. There are really wonderful ways to make quote unquote learning fun, and we can reinvest in those. We can put money back in even Saturday morning programming. I learned the preamble to the Constitution because of Schoolhouse Rock. I don't know what kinds of I don't know what kids have now, but Schoolhouse Rock was wonderful. Those kinds of kind of public programming we can reinvest in, and they mattered. Electric company, I learned how to read. Many children of my generation learned how to read because of the electric company. Those aren't heavy lifts that can supplement what kids do. And I would encourage schools and colleges of education to pick up that mantle, or at least partner with their local public television programming to provide that. Though that's a very easy lift. When I was at Ohio State, we had an initiative to come up with winter break learning tips. And we targeted urban communities with just simple ways that you could do kind of math exercises with your children while you were cooking or while you're cleaning, just while you're home. How do you maximize this time at home? That is an easy lift. And everyone had heard that commercial. When I went to church, she was like, "You're the lady who was talking about cooking." Like that's not, again, it's not a heavy lift for schools and colleges of education. And for public institutions, that's our mandate. Our mandate is to serve the public. And I'm always going to kind of harp on what kind of neighbor are we as public institutions.
I'll resist the urge, Adrienne, to break into the Zoom theme song for you. Just that's one of my favorites, but I'll resist the urge. We've got just a few minutes left, and I want to make sure we finish on time here. So let me ask. I'll finish up with the same question to each of the panelists, and I would ask you to try to keep your response to less than a minute if you could, which I know is hard, but please try. If you could identify one thing that we need to do in order to build our schools back better post-pandemic, what would it be? And Shayna, let me start with you.
On the spot to go first. I think I would ask that schools see our children as human. I think that humanization of children is missing from our current schools, and it had a lot to do with what was spoken about here today. I think when you talk about the subject of race and reopening, race allows us not to see children as human, especially when you talk about schools. You see them as who they are, and that's the color of their skin, which means that they need to, in some folks' minds, they need to be over policed. Parents don't need to be respected. They don't need to be a part of the conversation, because we just always need to operate from a deficit with Black children or children in urban areas, which is completely unfair. So I would say that one thing is please begin to look at our children as humans, and please include our families and our communities as a part of the conversation.
Thank you. That was a minute as well. Thank you very much. Adrienne, one thing, building schools back better post-pandemic. What's the one thing you would want to leave us with?
I would want them to completely reimagine every aspect of their operations. So curriculum, pedagogy, opening and closing schedule, engagement with parents, just a complete reimagining. We don't have to go to school from 8 to 3. We don't have to go 5 days a week. Let's be creative and think. I mean, if we're going to be innovative, let's really be innovative across the board and to bring in people that you don't normally talk to. So someone who works at the grocery store, someone who drives the bus, as well as grandparents, et cetera.
Thank you. Thank you. And Otis, last word, one thing, building schools back better post-pandemic.
I think I would like for our leaders to pursue the redress of past racial injustice as vigorously as they pursued racial injustice in the past. I really want us to be clear about these disparities and call them what they are. And as Adrienne said, reimagine a racially just educational system that invests in our kids in the way that we would want people to invest in our own kids.
Thank you. Thank you. And great. Appreciate the brevity. Again, I want to thank each of our panelists for what I thought was a really insightful, critical discussion. I learned a lot. I hope the audience did as well. We're going to continue to examine how American education is being transformed by this pandemic as we move forward. Next week on March 22nd at 4 p.m., we're going to bring together 3 leading practitioners, and we're going to be tackling the subject of innovative responses to learning loss as we look at critical equity issues. So please come back and register for this upcoming session. Our guests next week are going to include Cammie Anderson, who's founder of Third Way Solutions and the former superintendent of Newark Public Schools, Kachera Bradford, who is the deputy superintendent of learning at Providence Public Schools in Rhode Island, and Amelia Coleman Brown, associate superintendent in the School District of Philadelphia. Next week's discussion is going to be moderated by Sarah Johnson, who's the co-director of the Consortium for School-Based Health Solutions here at Johns Hopkins. Finally, a big thank you to our entire eSchool Plus team who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to bring all of this to you. As a reminder, the eSchool Plus initiative at Johns Hopkins is a collaboration between the Consortium for School-Based Health Solutions, the Berman Institute for Bioethics, and the Johns Hopkins Schools of Education, Medicine, and Public Health. Thank you to the audience for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you next week. Goodbye.